Hello, everyone. Welcome once again to What Does That Piece Do? My name is Joe, and today I'm going to bring in a guest that we're going to have a discussion on some topics that are near and dear to our heart. I'm really looking forward to this. So really excited to be talking with him. He's a fellow gamer, history enthusiast, content creator. He's got some podcasts, namely Wargames to Go and Board Games to Go. So please welcome to the channel, Mark Johnson. Hi, Mark. How's it going?
Hey, Joe. Great. Thanks for having me.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Now, we've been having discussions on and off through different channels and social media and whatnot. I think we both have a fairly similar approach to history and how we use games to learn about history. And we were kind of touching on some topics that were very similar and overlapping too. Like I've been really interested in Indigenous narratives, and you've been talking a lot lately about first contacts, like Europeans first contacting Indigenous folks in North America. So I thought this would be a good point to have a discussion, and we might even continue this discussion beyond today. Hopefully, maybe on his podcast if I go crash that party. But for starters, some people probably already know. You've probably brought a lot of people over from your fan base, and hoping you get to maybe meet get some new listeners through this as well. Hopefully, we'll see how that goes. But first, tell us about your podcast.
All right, cool. Yeah. So I was doing already a Eurogame style board games to go podcast for a long time, actually like 20 years. It's crazy how long that's been going on. And then somewhere around 10 years ago, a little over 10, 11 years ago, I was getting re-interested in wargaming, and I started a wargame podcast. And I thought about at one point, well, I'll just use the same feed. And I thought, actually, maybe most of my board game listeners may not be as interested in wargames and history as I am. And I thought, I'll just make another feed. So I've had this Wargames to Go thing going for that time. But, 11 years sounds like, oh, wow, I've been around forever. Must have do a lot of shows. No, because they're incredibly irregular. It's like I take forever. It's totally a personal thing that I do. And it's like, I'm going to go ahead and talk about it. If it's of interest to anyone else, great. But don't expect it monthly. Don't expect it bi-monthly. Don't expect it quarterly. It happens whenever it happens.
Yeah, I could appreciate that. Not the most consistent in the world either. It's when inspiration strikes, right? And I think for you anyway, it seems like when you get into a topic or a subject that you really want to explore, and I'm kind of the same way too. But tell me, because I've been listening to your show quite a bit lately, and by the way, one of the smoothest, nicest FM radio voices I've ever heard in any of these gaming circle podcasts. By the way, I could listen to you read the phone book, so it's really easy to get into your shows. So yeah, I really like the way that you reference games as sort of a learning experience and how they can inform a particular perspective on history. At what point did you start leveraging games in an educational way? Like, was there any one moment you realized, like, hey, I can actually learn something from this, and I think others are interested in learning too?
Yeah, I guess so. I'm a wargamer from way back. I started as a kid, probably like a lot of kids, maybe. So, like when I was in 7th grade, from a classmate taught me something, and that was way back. I'm old now, so that was way back in 1979. But back in those days, I was interested in science fiction war games. So Ogre, GEV, Starfleet Battle, stuff like that. So that's what I played, and then it was. I dabbled a little bit in historical war games, especially like air combat games. That was kind of something I liked. But I wasn't really a big history guy. I mean, I've been sort of a techie nerd geek sort of guy all along. And when I was young like that, history bored me, frankly. And this is probably kind of cliche, but it wasn't until I grew up that I realized how fascinating history really is. And I did a little historical wargaming here and there along the line, but the real eye-opener kind of thing, and corresponds to when I started the podcast, was it's kind of funny because so many wargamers have done this exact thing, but I had that epiphany where I realized that, I can play them solitaire, and this is the important part, and there's nothing wrong with that, right? It just felt for a long time like, oh, that was lesser. That wasn't the way the hobby should be. That wasn't the way I really wanted to enjoy the games. But, waiting around for 2 players and it just wasn't happening for me. And then when my oldest kid, she's really into history, but when she was, left to go to college, empty nest, that was sort of the eye opener. It's like, oh yeah, all these games I've been sort of saving up for, like her as an opponent or whatever. It's like, That's not going to happen. If I'm going to want to play these, I'm going to play them solitaire, which, I'm a big Wargame magazine guy. So it's like in editorials from Dunnigan and whatever else, like I know that tons of Wargamers have played them solitaire for a long time, but I still had this hang up that like, that wasn't, there was something wrong and I didn't want to do that. And then some sort of switch flipped and I thought like, that's how I'm going to do it. And, once in a while dedicated solitaire games, but mostly playing both sides,
Okay.
And then the other light bulb went on with that was realizing like, oh, this actually feels less like playing a game, although that's part of it. It feels more like studying a subject. It feels more like reading a book, right? And so I was interested in war games, but I probably hadn't read very many history books at all at that time. So then that sort of opens up to me. I mentioned I like magazine war games partly because I like the accompanying articles, and so that all just kind of came together. I realized, oh, I can like dive deeper into a subject. Gettysburg happened to be like, I'm a West Coast kid from California, so we didn't have battlefields around, but on a school trip, and I was, in high school or something, went to Gettysburg and it was like, oh my gosh, it was amazing. So and of course there are no shortage of Gettysburg games. So I kind of started there and I probably read a little bit more, but I also had the idea, it's like, oh, I actually have a handful, like probably most war games do, a handful of Gettysburg games. Maybe I'll play, aspirationally all of them. I probably played about 4, but then thought, oh, and that sometimes they're at different scales. Sometimes they kind of have a different approach to the things, and so all that kind of came together, which is solitaire play, different games on the same subject, and then reading about it. And then the last thing I sprinkled in was I thought like, well, everyone else seems way smarter than me about military history, has much more depth and background in it, but I like movies. And so I thought like, there are war movies and a lot of them aren't good. Some of them aren't good. Some of them aren't good movies. Most of them aren't good history. Once in a while, they might be sort of good at 1 or 2 of those things. And so I thought, well, that's the other hook. So it was like I mentioned, going to the battlefield. So it's travel, getting a chance to see these places, which I've been lucky enough to do some things. And then the books and the multiple games and the movies and all kind of came together. And so I realized like, oh, it's like a chunk of study. It's like you mentioned the word educational. I never really thought of it as educational other than for me, right? So it's like, and since I already had the other podcast, I thought, well, I'll do this. Since I'm exploring it anyway, I'll just record my thoughts about it. And if it's of no interest to anybody, it's no skin off my nose. And if some people like it, well, then great. Then I'm giving back a little bit.
Awesome. Very cool. Yeah, I think educational is like one way I refer to these. Sometimes I've been thinking of them lately as kind of applied learning.
Yeah.
Like, now you're starting to get your hands, the subject, you're starting to learn the subject, maybe read a book, watched a movie, then you start moving some things around and see how the situations evolve. That's where it's like, for me, that's where some of these things start to click. And I like what you said though about solo gaming. It's like, yeah, I've kind of had to just sort of coach myself into that too. It's like the reason why we get to the table, or what brought me to the table originally, and again, a lot of Euro games to start, and some other simpler games that aren't to deal with history, maybe they're sci-fi based, but it was with getting together people. It's a really good reason to get together with some buddies and hang out and have some fun and have a bit of a competition here. With some of these, I started going off in this direction from my original group that was very pedantic into history. It's like I saw some things sort of represented on the board, so like, oh, but I want to really get into this, and like I want to know the truth about whatever the history about this subject. And then that's why I think solo games are good, or being able to play them solo. It's like you can get as pedantic as you want and really dive into it. And sometimes there's really tough decisions to make. And you don't really have to wait on the other person, or they don't have to wait on you. And it depends on who's at the table too. Like the thing I keep thinking of too is like, when you're coming together to play these games, do you want a competition or do you want a conversation? Right. So I don't know if this is something that you struggle with too. It's like, well, we want to be competitive because that's what makes the game tick, but also like part of it's just like the experience, right? And knowing the story. So it's like, that is something at least you can pace on your own when you're doing it solo. So I've really come to appreciate that too.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me, I get the argument, and it's probably more right than wrong, that all these games, that there's a spectrum of and a continuum of games between, really abstract or quasi-themeless or based on theme to a really simulationist sort of thing at the other end. But I don't really feel it that way. I feel it in two distinct modes. Like if I'm playing Eurogame night with my friends, it's like we're playing there to like be together, to laugh, to have fun, and to win the game. I mean, I'm not very competitive, but it's like most of these games have no point except to play the rules to win the game. And at war games, it's like I usually have to remind myself, oh yeah, I actually should be trying to win this, even if I'm playing solo, right? Because it's too much of a sandbox. Too much in a good way. It's like it's too enticing to just play around with stuff, and see how the model is kind of working. And so it feels, my subjective experience is real different in those two types of games, and I like the exploration of the war game and the history behind it.
Yeah, you say it doesn't have a point, right? And other than to win. And I kind of think of, I use the Liz Davidson term. She mentions this a meaningful play. It's like, I've been thinking about that a lot. It's okay, well, I hope to get something out of it. Hopefully I'm learning something or just stretching my mental muscles a little bit if it is more of an abstract thing. But there's always that, like, can I really justify sitting this long staring at a table with cardboard bits and pieces if I'm not going to accomplish something? But it's right, yeah. That's why I think the history games, at least, well, you are learning, hopefully at least learning a perspective, right? Yeah. And I do like on your show you blend in the talk about like books, movies, TV, and other ways to learn or to gain an understanding of these histories. I really like the one on Vietnam. You did a bunch of the Vietnam games. Like I was getting myself psyched up to play Fire in the Lake, and I started thinking of all the movies that I'd watched, like kind of growing up as a kid. Like in the '80s, there was a bunch that came out, and I really love your trip down that movie theater memory lane. That was really cool. Yeah. Is there any like, I don't know, say like an ideal gateway? Is there something that like you watch a movie first, then you want to play it, or you read a book, then you want to watch a movie, or there's a bunch of different entry points, but is there any? They serve different purposes, I guess, right?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. I'm not sure what the right answer is, because there's too much. There's a lot of crosstalk between them. Let me think about this. So I have. I like traveling a lot, and I try to work in a little military history, travel sightseeing if I get a chance wherever we go. And I have tried reading about a place before I go, because I think, while I'm there, I want to make sure and maximize what I don't want to miss. I can't believe I was so close and I didn't see that thing, whatever. I want to figure it out. And well, here's a good example. I can remember, a dozen years ago, we got to take a family trip that included Rome. The one time I visited Rome. Well, what an enormous topic, right? So I tried to read a bunch about Rome. It's crazy, right? I tried to read a bunch about Rome before we got there. And we got there and saw all the usual things, the tourist things, and I loved it. But then after I came back and I was reading more, it clicked so much better. It was like reading about it. I guess reading is for me a tougher entry point. Certainly being there in person is the best. War games are probably second best, because I get a huge part out of the map. The map and the order of battle, I think, gives me so much connection to it, way more than the rules ever do. It's just like there's something visual / visceral about that, and the road network or why that river was important, all that kind of stuff really clicks through the map. So I think, a little bit of reading for context, and then the game makes a lot more sense, and then probably more reading yet, I guess. And then movies are super fun, but movies are kind of, in many ways, the worst about, you kind of have to already know the topic to even know what the movie is doing right or doing wrong or whatever. It's very rare for a movie. I mean, it isn't a documentary, and that's a different kind of thing too.
Yeah, exactly.
I love them, but they are the worst about learning things.
That's true. It's like, you got to know, and then so you can pick it apart, if anything, right? It's crazy how similar we are in that respect. Like, I didn't even think about that, but like travel as well. Like, I'm the same way. It's I'm thinking back to trips to like Turkey and wanted to read about, Istanbul, Constantinople, and all
Yeah.
that. Or when I was going to Spain, I was getting really hyped on Spanish. Well, kind of getting into our topic here, I read a really great book called Dogs of God, which is about Isabel and Ferdinand and all the things that were happening during their time. The Spanish Inquisition, and expelling Jews, expelling Muslims from the Caliphate from there, and the last stand of the Moors in Granada and things like that, and then Christopher Columbus, the discovery of America, like all these things that were happening at the time. But yeah, really to then see some of the places too, that really helps. Like I didn't even think about mentioning that. I love travel. I just got back from the East Coast in Canada here, and learned some great history stuff along the way. So now I'm on that topic. Let's talk about that. Like we were kind of like jiving back and forth on approaches to history when it comes to this topic. I'm been looking at the broader topic of indigenous narratives in games, because I think we both agreed like sometimes the Indians just show up as like an element that don't get to be played or don't get to be properly represented. And you've gone another level. Like you've gotten really it sounds like focused on a topic around first contact, the contacts of Europeans in Native communities here. So what led you to want to learn more about that topic specifically?
Well, yeah. So it's a funny path. One is some games I was interested in, some subjects I already knew about or was reading about, and then trying to think like, how can I connect some of these things and put a bow around them? So I'll show you right here. So here we go. Right here. Command Magazine, okay. Cortez. Yeah. Okay. I was kind of a latecomer to Magazine Wargames, but I love them and dove in with 2 feet. This one was published in '93. And I remember when it came out, I was like, well, I didn't get it when it came out. I probably got it 10 years later or 5 years later or whatever. But I thought, oh my gosh, a war game about Cortez and the Aztecs. Even today, that's pretty unusual. And what is that? That's 30 years ago, 93, right? It's like, yeah. I mean, it was incredibly, I thought how unusual to have that topic. And then keep going, magazine. I'm only going to show 2. Don't worry. This isn't going to be a whole thing. So then they picked this big thing I like. So Cortez et la Conquête de Mexique. So another, and it's like, oh my gosh, I have 2 magazine war games about Cortez that I already thought was unusual to begin with. And now I have 2. So I thought, oh man, that is like a third rail of a subject, conquistadors, for crying out loud, it's like, who knows what point of view, what agencies on what sides, or how well they tell the story. I don't know. And I haven't played them yet, so I don't really know, but I thought that'll be interesting. Well, that'll be interesting to finally get to that. And then I happened to be a year ago, well, within the last year, there's a couple books I read about different things. I happened to be traveling on the East Coast of the U.S., and we went right through Roanoke Island, and I ended up reading a book about Roanoke. I kind of knew the Lost Colony and that sort of thing. And then I read the Company, which is about Hudson's Bay Company up there with you in Canada. And it was like all of these things, although they had very different flavors, they were more or less first contact, First contact in the case of Aztecs is probably... It's different. It's not the actual battle at the Capitol. There's literal first contact comes earlier. But then I thought about, there could be a common thread between these things. And then I thought I can get up on a little mini soapbox about how, if the only lens for looking at these things is like hex encounter war games, then the treatments are going to be very narrow in what they do. It's going to be the big battle, right? And this could apply to, Plains Indian Wars and things like that too, although I'm not going there. Maybe you are. But I thought, I'm very excited about this kind of recent expansion of, let's just still call it wargaming, into more general history gaming. So it is not Eurogames, definitely not. It is really about real history something, but it's not always, warriors / tanks on a hex grid or area map, whatever. It can take modeling of interesting subjects, and whether it's Amabel Holland or there's some really creative minds doing some really amazing things. And yes, their point of they might start with a sort of military history base, but they can do more things. And as I read about first contact stories in all different parts of the New World, I realized that, none of that is strictly speaking military, not until maybe later. And so once upon a time when people might have thought, well, then no one can make a game about it because we don't know what to do. It's like, I don't know how to make a game about it either, but someone could, right? Someone could do, here are these two cultures meeting. It's an amazing event in the history of our world. It is like a fulcrum event
pivotal.
in history,
Yeah.
history of our world. And I love when our hobby is able to model social and other historical things. It's like, we don't have that much source narrative, but we do have more than you might think. And so it's like there could be games about this. So anyway, I call it First Contact, even though I know there really aren't that many games that cover that exactly, or they just cover it around the edges. And this, these couple conquest of, Aztec Empire things are more conventional wargaming, which aren't really First Contact at all. But I'm using it as a vehicle to sort of tie it all together.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense, and I agree with you 100%. Like, there's only so much you can show in the conflict itself. Like the Ve Victus one, I knew about. Actually, I knew about both of them. The Ve Victus one, I did want to check out, especially when I got into the topic. Well, I'm going to do show and tell too.
Okay, yeah.
This is a book. I think it's been recommended to you already.
It has,
this is a
on
really
my list.
Good one. When Montezuma met Cortez, and it's about the actual social interaction that happened, and it's such a bizarre story. Like, there's battle, and there's alliances with other native tribes there that wanted to see the Aztecs fall and Tenochtitlan fall and all that. But just the fact of like how they met and how they interpreted each other, and Cortez was living among them. Like, Montezuma is essentially a captive within his own palace. There was this weird sort of relationship thing going on. It's like, who's in control here? Like, there's only so much you can do with, like, battle sequence type of engine of a game. Like, there's all the social or the mental that's going on here. So and that's one thing I think about when I think of games like this, and like kind of the European or North American Western view of like how to approach these games, how to approach these battles. They are also like area control based and stuff. And that's why I think things, going even further down the line of like just indigenous interaction at all, like through the development, like after 1492 or after 1521, it's like, did controlling land matter much to the natives and the individual and the indigenous? Not in the same way that it did to Europeans that were coming over and trying to colonize and create land. So I think there's got to be a different approach there. And honestly, I'll say I have thought about like, how would you model this? I started to actually try and draft up something myself a little bit and played with some ideas. It's on a shelf for now, and I've never fully designed a game myself. But it's like, that is a nut to crack. That, and like, I would like to see someone do it properly, right? The one thing I will say, so as far as like trying to model this interaction, this first contact interaction thing, there's a really great model for that I've seen in a prototype game right now, and it's, again, sci-fi based. And this is the thing, there's a lot of like dichotomies between sci-fi and exploration and stuff, and age of exploration that as we know it here in the real world. Non-breaking space, NDSP. He's got he's got a few games in the works with GMT Orbit, like Cross-Bronx Expressway, for example. I had asked his permission to talk about this briefly too, because I'd play tested a game of his a while back, about a year or so ago, called Petal, and it PETAL.
Okay.
And he's going to dust that off and get that going. But it is about like exploration in space and alien factions meeting each other. And he had this really neat system of like, when these two meet, are they going to fight? Because I had broken it down to, I'd misremembered it, but read it back to him. He's like, well, that's actually pretty cool. But I thought of it as contact, communication, and culture. But he has it, I've got it written here. He's got it more or less about habitat, governance, and cosmogeny. Habitat then is what you see. So you see a completely other alien type of race, whatever. Habitat is what you see. Governance is how you interact, and cosmogeny, don't know if I'm saying that right, is what you believe. So then it's like, are we going to just start shooting at each other right away when we see each other? Or are we going to try and make contact? Is something in that communication going to force us to butt heads then? Or are we going to try and get along and live among each other, then learn things about each other that are fundamentally different value systems, and then that's where we're going to fight? So I think there's things like that need to be used to model the type of like first contact interactions we're talking about here. So anyway, I thought it was interesting, but there's so many parallels between like space travel and finding, new races and like what we've seen happen, in North America and South America in general. But yeah, if you, any other things like that come to mind? I mean, you talking about like a sci-fi guy. Does that kind of resonate?
Yeah. I mean, I played another game. I'm forgetting the name of it now, and it really is. It uses alien encounters. It's sort of like the conspiracy theories about aliens building the pyramids in Egypt or something like that. It uses that as a theme, right? And so one side's the Egyptians and one side's the aliens, and you're trying to learn how to communicate with each other. And so it does the mechanics of just initial communication when you have no common language. It's like, but that's not really contact exactly. That's translation and communication. It's just about that part of it. And it's a great game. It's super interesting. The other thought I have, of course, is that a subject, and maybe this is a cheat, I don't know, a subject this sort of complex might be better as a role-playing game. I have my role-playing history in the back too. It's like that's where you can do interpersonal and sort of like that. Like I can imagine some sort of creative Montezuma meets Cortez one-shot role-playing game. It's like, it could be incredible, right? But I'm not interested. I mean, my role-playing games are in the past. That's not really what I'm interested in these days. So, I mean, someone as a game designer might do that, but I don't really even know if First Contact makes sense for history games. But I do think that lots of things that people didn't used to think would translate well into a board game with rules, pieces on a board or a map kind of thing format. We've been finding more and more in just the last 5 years, like, oh, no. The art form of game design is much broader than that. You can do much more interesting things. We've been thinking much too conventionally for a long time.
Yeah.
And I wish I could lead the way. I can't. I'm not a designer, but I know some of these other people can.
Well, at least us having these discussions maybe are starting to trigger some ideas. So I can appreciate that. I agree with you too. It's like, oh, that can't be done until it can. Right. So there might be some other creative minds that'll come up with ideas here. And it's just further on the topic then, when we're talking about like the First Contact, again, that's kind of a broad term. Like there are specific things, and like we said, specific pivotal points in history. Columbus landing on Hispaniola, Cortez conquering the Aztecs eventually, and Pizarro and whatnot. But there were other contacts along the way, right? There's older European contacts, and we're finding out more and more, like Vikings and whatnot, but up in Newfoundland. And then recently, I was more show and tell here. So I was recently in Nova Scotia. I got my hands on this book. It's "We Are Not the Savages" by Dean Paul, and it's about the Mi'kmaq people in what is today Nova Scotia. But so again, this is more like the Indigenous Narratives. It talks about like the interaction and how things kind of fell apart a little bit after a while between interactions between colonizers like the English and the French, and what those interactions are like. But there's something really interesting in here let me just find this section, and it's about like how things could have been different if Columbus landed in a different part of. In retrospect, so the theory here is that when Columbus landed and he met the Tainos, who were somewhat like segregated on an island of Hispaniola, which is today Haiti and Dominican Republic.
Right.
The Taino people were quite a bit more pacifist, and they kind of like just greeted them, and they were pretty easily subjugated quickly. But this is the theory here. In retrospect, if he instead landed in a non-pacifist country such as that of the Iroquois or the Maya and started to ravage what he found, history would have turned out differently. Their warriors would have fought back ferociously and very probably ending his voyage on the American side of the Atlantic. If this had happened and no European had appeared for another century or so, population growth and technology development would have reduced the possibility of European invasion and colonization considerably. However, history turned out the way it did, and no amount of fantasizing can change that.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting because, to the point of like there were other contacts, interactions, maybe they traded and then maybe they were, scared off and didn't want to, but like when Columbus had the ability, because he landed on that island, it was a place to kind of like, all right, take over here, jumping off point. And that led to Cortez being able to go on to, further in the interior of what is today Mexico, I think. So I just thought that was interesting.
Sure. And from what I know, a couple things. One is I'm looking forward to reading about this, is I know the Spanish themselves tried many times to invade / dominate whatever Florida, never made it. That's all contemporary with what's going on. So and then going back, you mentioned the Norse earlier. The Norse they settled Iceland. They settled Iceland. They settled Greenland. They sprinkle a little settlements here and there in North America, Labrador, whatever. And they don't last that long in North America. I think we're finding out more now, but they basically are unsuccessful. And there's references in the sagas to, hostile interactions with the natives, either because they were naturally more hostile or because the Norse were, idiotic in their interaction, with them or whatever, Meanwhile, they managed to stay in Greenland, even though there's natives there too. There's not natives in Iceland. So it's like, there actually are a few different examples, of how this stuff goes. There is the whole specter of old world diseases, and that appears to be kind of a biologically locked in one-way exchange, one-way bias exchange. I think no matter who landed where, that was going to have apparently a one-sided effect. But it is interesting, right? I think that I like that. I like that alternative history where Columbus sets out and is never heard from again, right? I think that's a different.
His name's not in the history books. It's a footnote at that point. Yeah,
right. Because it's not so clear that someone else climbs on a ship 2 years later and tries the same thing. It might set everyone back for a long time, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, interesting point just about like how the diseases ravage too, and like it's like any game that doesn't take that into account when it's talking about this, it's just steel against spears or whatever, and it's not thinking about that is, I don't think, doing the history justice. But you have to be very careful about how you do that. Like we're talking about just the entire populations being wiped out. Just because of contact and interaction. So that's the tough thing you got to take that into account, because I keep going back to Guns, Germs, and Steel. Like that's one of the books that kind of led me down this path too, and I'm learning more and more about that and how it's like not very well researched, and it makes some giant leaps and assumptions, and people are picking apart now. But it's what piqued my curiosity, because it did ask that question. It's like, why did Cortez end up on the footsteps of Montezuma's palace? Instead of the other way around? It's like, okay, let's talk about that. And then you start to realize, like, well, there's a lot of, unfortunately, I believe, like racist assumptions. It was just like, oh, white people or Christians are superior, and therefore they were able to sail the seas, and God was on their side and everything. It's like, well, it's history being told by the victors. It's like, well, they are powerful and whatnot because they were able to go, and disease wiped out a bunch of people, and they could take over their lands and their gold and things. So there's a lot to really. It's you're right. It's such a third rail. It's such a touchy subject to get into.
And here's something else I liked when you brought up Jared Diamond's book, and I read that too, and it was fascinating.
It's fascinating. Yeah, it's fascinating if nothing else.
Fascinating to me. Yeah. And I think my brother got it for me when he was new, so I read it back then. And now, as I'm plugged into more of a historian community or armchair historian community, whichever, I find there's some problems or big limitations with that book. That's fine. The thing that's interesting to me is that, now this may sound stupid, but when I was younger, I would have thought this kind of history was, not very dynamic, already well established. We know what happened, right? And you had that when Montezuma met Cortez book. It's like the idea that we are still finding out new things about what happened when Cortez and the Aztecs had their event is amazing to me. And now I understand. Oh yeah, there's all. It's sort of like that scene at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark. The records in Seville about the New World are enormous, and so we still find actually primary material, let alone archaeological material, let alone other sorts of things, and indirect data sources. So it's like that's super exciting to me, that this is a much more dynamic field of historical study than I would have guessed. And whatever books we might read today in 2024 that are very exciting will probably in 20, 30 years be thought like, well, that's what they thought in 2024. But now we know this. And I would not have guessed that this subject would have had that quality.
Yeah. It's like treating history as a science. I'm really starting to understand and appreciate historiography. Like, how
Hmm.
does history come together? Who gets to tell it? How does it evolve over time? And new evidence to introduce? Like, you can't just be locked into this one way of thinking, like the way we're brought up, and probably maybe the way you learned history in high school. Maybe why it didn't grab you at first. It's like, okay, names and dates
Yeah.
and things like that, and places, maps, great for sure. But it's like, well, we're learning all sorts of different things about how borders are drawn and how they come to be over time. And then I threw this term at you, and I think this is kind of a approach that
Mm.
we're both taking. Is this idea of it's a rethinking first contact and indigenous narratives and who's telling the story is kind of this post-colonial approach, as I understand it. Does that term resonate with you?
Yeah, right. Once I had to look it up to figure out what
Yep.
exactly it meant. I mean, I thought I got it, but yes, I think so too. I mean, that is, like I was just saying, I think this is interesting how this is changing over time, but it feels to me like you and I are living through a pretty substantial shift. It's not just a gradual path. I feel like there's been a pretty substantial shift happened in, I don't know, the last 50 years let's say for sure, probably, of understanding of where the voices in this history are coming from and things like that. So
Yeah.
yes, I would agree.
And for reference, and I did manage to take the Oxford Bibliography's definition of it, just so people know what we're talking about here. And I think it's a term that I'm still trying to like wrap my brain around. But like, here's their definition: it's post-colonial theory is a body of thought primarily concerned with accounting for political, aesthetic, economic, historical, and social impact of European colonial rule around the world in the 18th through the 20th century. Post-colonial theory takes many different shapes and interventions, but all share a fundamental claim that the world we inhabit is impossible to understand except in relationship to the history of imperialism and colonial rule. So that's a
Yeah.
mouthful, but that's kind of like, yeah, that's how I'm understanding too. I grew up in Canada, the Dominion of Canada, right? And so we
Yeah.
learned a very Canadian from the British kind of perspective, and I'm sure doing some of the same things like growing up in America too, right?
Sure, sure. In fact, just yesterday we were talking about this holiday weekend that I was just on. But just yesterday I mentioned I'm a California kid. Every California kid learns about the Spanish missions, right, and visits them
Okay.
and does a school project on them, things like that. We live and breathe this sort of stuff. And so we went to one mission, San Luis Obispo, center of the state, and I've toured a bunch of missions, and so I kind of know what to expect. But what was so interesting was, there's a, white lady grandma who's giving the tour. And although her interpretation of historical events was maybe not as modern and progressive as I would have really liked, I thought this is so much different than when I was like a fourth grader, which is when you learn about missions as public school system in California. It's
Yeah.
like that many years ago, which is a lot of years ago. That's almost it's close to 50 years ago. It's like, oh no, even the sort of uh, Catholic diocese tour of the mission, because it's still at a Catholic church too. It's like it has already incorporated much better understanding of what was going on with the native peoples that were there. And they have a ways to go. But it just shows me that, that post-colonialism thinking is, maybe really actively pursued at some academic level, but it is sort of being more broadly understood.
Yeah.
It's seeping down through a lot more understanding. That's
Yeah, I
exciting to
think
see.
I think I had a somewhat similar experience, but slightly different. When I was recently at Fort Louisbourg in Nova Scotia. The
Yeah.
first time I ever been to a place like that, by the way. It was like a recreated fort
That's
area.
one of my
Like,
bucket list places to go. I
oh,
haven't.
it's amazing. I mean, so this was a French fort, English fort? Yeah, French fort was
French. Yeah.
subjugated by the English, but then there was a lot of like, interaction, obviously, with the Mi'kmaq people there. But they had rebuilt a lot of this village basically in the 60s
Mm.
and 70s. Out of work miners were helped to put this all together. It's really great recreations. I've never been to Gettysburg or anything like that, where people are wearing the period costumes
Yeah.
and they're talking and they're telling the stories. And young lady that was giving the tour and talking about all the things going on, and when she did reference the Mi'kmaq people, she did say, and like she's putting on the airs of of a British person living at the
Okay.
time and
Yeah.
saying, "Oh, and we were just terrible to them, awful, absolutely awful." It's like, okay, acknowledging that, but then moving on. It's like there's not much other context. It's like, yeah, I know things were bad, and then but then you're still getting like the European history is kind of what that tour is all about. So it's like I can kind of appreciate that, but like, oh, and okay, that's a different tour. Okay, that's fine. So it's interesting to see the way some of these things are trickling up there. But yeah, it's just I think, yeah, like you said, games have a way to go to really show us that and appreciation of it. So you showed the 2 magazine games you have, and understand, well, you've got a geek list too that you're building of all the games that you want to explore. Are there any like top, and we'll put the link to that geek list in the description for this video, but are there any specifically you're looking forward to that you want to dive into in
Well, I'll
your
mention
future?
a few. Yeah, I mean, this is sort of my normal practice, is that I'm going to dive into a subject. I'm going to look at multiple games around a subject. That itself is a list. And instead of just having a little list on a notebook in my back pocket, I thought I might as well make a geek list, both because that way it's connected to the database, but also because it's public. So people sometimes, not that often, but people sometimes suggest other games. And I, say like, Mark, have you thought about this one, and put them on the list. So and it's, and then if people want to see, well, what does he think he's going to play? Now, these lists tend to be aspirational. Like I'll list 15 games and get to like 4 or 5 of them, but I've got the 2 that I just mentioned. There's another companion game about in the Inca Empire, but then there's a couple, and I bet you one of them's on your list. A lot of people know Navajo Wars. I have not played Navajo Wars. My copy is still sitting in shrink wrap on the shelf, but I heard that one of the scenarios starts pre-contact and includes encounter with the original, in this case, overland Spanish explorers in the American Southwest. Do you know, is that true by chance? Do you know anything about that?
I don't know Navajo Wars. I had peeked at it and I tried playing it online a while ago, just using Vassal, and I kind of got stuck on it. But then I got my hands on Comancheria, and I played the crap out of that one, and I do want to visit Navajo Wars at some point. So I think I looked at Snare Book. I couldn't tell you off the top of my head.
All right. Well, I want to check
that out. Put it into Fiddle Advance, or maybe when I do an edit on this video. But wouldn't be surprised if there's something to sink your teeth into there.
Yeah, and on a similar vein, there's a game. It was by Victory Point Games, when those guys had the little slipcase boxes and called Mound Builders, and I had it before and I played it and thought it was just okay, and it moved on, and then I got a chance to reacquire it when I knew I was going to do this subject. So it's like the Mound Builder, civilization. This is like in the. Is that the same thing as the Mississippian civilization?
I've got it up. Actually, I did call that one up because I did remember you mentioned it. Defend the Mississippian culture of ancient America in the solitaire game. It's like a States of Siege type game, right?
Kind of, yeah. It is States of Siege, so that has limited context for modeling. But and I don't recall if there actually is European contact, but maybe there is. Anyway, but those ones are interesting because they are non-kinetic warfare type games, right? So it's about something different. It's not, when I showed the Cortez one before, it's a hex map. It actually shows, the capital city and the causeways. And I mean, it really is very tactical. These other ones like Mound Builders kind of tip the pendulum, for my preference, too far the other way. Now it's just about this society and its economic equilibrium that it's trying to do, and dealing with weather and droughts and things like that. And it doesn't really have contact, but somewhere in between those things, this mythical Goldilocks game for me would be the first contact one. And then one more odd one that I will list is that, and by the way, you notice I'm not listing the Conquistadors game from
Compass. Or the old
well, that one from Compass more recently, because there was like a strategy and tactics SPI game, Conquistador Age of Exploration. I think those are just too old school in their approach, as far as I think all the agency is like, you can be the Dutch, you can be the French, you can be whatever, and you're all trying to compete to just go to the New World and take over more than the other guy. And I just feel like, well, I may be wrong in that characterization, but I don't think so. I think that's more or less right. And it's like, okay, that was very, let's just be kind and say that's 1970s thinking about wargaming in this topic. And we've come a long way. And so I'm not so interested in that. But, last one might be both Greenland which is a oh gosh, I'm forgetting the designer's name here. I'm going to look it up real quick. Oh, Phil Eklund, who is himself an interesting, controversial figure, but it has the nature of the Norse and the Native American, actually two different types of native groups, I think, both the Thule and the Inuit or something like that. So it is, having a game of Norse first contact is even more rare than these other ones with Spain. So I thought that's interesting to see what goes on. So
cool. Right on. Well, you got a pretty cool list, and I hear you. I was wondering if you got to mention Conquistadors, because it's kind of one that I see it, and it appears on people's shelves and mentions and things like that. And I think you and I probably have the same apprehension about approaching that. Like, it sounds like, yeah, there's no agency for Indigenous folks. They just kind of get stomped on. It's like the goal is just to wipe them out or take them over or whatever. From my perspective, I know someone that had a copy, and I was willing to hold my nose and try. I still am. I'll hold my nose and try it and just see, okay, what's going on here. I think, as long as you're in the right frame of mind, you can really, take it with a grain of salt. But I tried once.
I mean, if it was on my shelf, I would absolutely include it just for completeness. If I had a chance to get if a buddy had a copy, and for completeness, I would check it out, but not enough to like hunt down a copy and play it myself. It's like, no. I'm not that dedicated to the exploration.
Yeah, awesome. And so again, great list, and I'll share that in the description of this video, so folks can go contribute as well, comment on it, just share ideas. Like, I love this idea of like, hey, play along or give your thoughts, whatever. I think that's really good. And as you're building this up, and when you do your podcast, you'll probably have a lot of other feedback and perspective from other folks too, and even from playing the games as well. So that's really good. To really kind of community sort of oriented approach to this. I really like that. So just thinking about other medias too, like you mentioned, books and TV and things like that. And by the way, so I love when you do that. You do it on your podcast. You kind of go through all the things that are worth mentioning. Maybe if I can crash that party, I think I'll bring a few more than just the books I flashed today, and other like movies and even soundtracks. I'll say this too, is like I've been listening to some pretty interesting Indigenous metal lately while I'm playing like Comancheria and stuff. So I can offer a few things there. But are there any other books, movies, TV shows that kind of helped with this journey?
Well, so a couple of things. The book you mentioned, I mean, I'm a huge audiobook fan, and I've got access to the whole like city of Los Angeles public library system is pretty vast. And so it's like, I do a lot of, if I can find any subject like on that, I will download it and listen to it. So there's a few I'm reading right now. What's it? Well, I read 1491. And then there's the 7 Myths of the Spanish Conquest or something like that. And so I'm most of the way through that one. And, we'll see how much more I go into. You already suggested a podcast series to me. And one thing that's interesting is it doesn't only apply to this subject. Frankly, it's applied to almost every subject I've done, is that more and more there's interesting material on YouTube and podcast series, and I guess you can say, I don't know about the academic credentials of whoever's behind it, but it's like, well, I'm not too hung up on that. I can listen to it and then decide this isn't for me or whatever, and you can tell sometimes when they include bibliographic type references, it's like it has a little bit more cred. But that ends up being kind of a deep rabbit hole. You can go and look at a lot of things, or there'll be some documentary from PBS that is now on YouTube, legal or not, and so there's like all sorts of material online to look at about that stuff. So
yeah, exactly. I think the podcast you're talking about would be the Empire podcast with William Dalrymple and Anita Anand. William Dalrymple, then he wrote the book, The Return of a King, which is what then PAX Premier's modeled on. That was one of my kind of gateways in and out of games, and reading, like, learning about this game, got into it, and learning about the book. I'm like, ooh, read. And so anyway, just to say, like, so that's a really good example. Someone with really good credentials. So it's really well researched. They bring in other experts and stuff too. And yeah, the Empire podcast right now is doing their series. They cover different empires. They did like the British Empire, East India Company. That was William Dalrymple's like he wrote a book on that too, The Anarchy. But they're doing the American Empire right now. So right from like, discovery of America, founding fathers, and then they get into a lot of indigenous related content, including talking about like the Trail of Tears. I think I'm in the middle of that one. They even warn you at the beginning, this is going to be hard to listen to. So I think that's a good example of one.
Well, let me tell you one thing. Since you turned me on to that, and I was listening to their first episode in this series, where we're talking about America, and this is another subject. A related subject. It's all tied together. They were talking about, everyone kind of, I don't know about everyone, but a lot of people know the Pocahontas story in Jamestown, Captain John Smith, and all that sort of thing. They might even know that, Pocahontas later on, went herself to the old world, to England. She's died and buried over there in England right now, right? And I had heard that. What I had not heard was that I think the way they described it is it might have been her uncle, because I think her father is the king, and it was the king's brother, that makes it uncle, right? Had been abducted by the Spanish, he and another guy who didn't survive, and taken to the old world. And then I forget the story about how they managed to escape or come back. And it's like, well, that's like the story of Squanto and the Mayflower. It's like there are a handful of I'm sure that in reality there were more than a handful. We know of a handful of times when there were people who literally were first contact, right? Here's a Spanish exploration ship or a Portuguese fishing ship or whatever, and they're off the coast, and someone sails out, paddles out in a canoe, and they get on board, and they're having that communication thing, and then all of a sudden the ship pulls up anchor and off they go, and they don't let them paddle home. And it's like, and then they learn some European languages, or maybe they go to this course. It's like, and there's a book I'm going to read about that too. I think it's called On Savage Shores, which is trying to collect the stories that we know about of New World individuals who were captured and brought over to Europe. And again, it's just pulling together threads. And it's like, I'm repeating myself here, but it's like, there's just more to learn. And some of the stuff has been learned in the last 50 years as we uncover new documents and things like that. It's more dynamic scholarship and research than I realized. Fascinating.
Yeah, for sure. But even some of the things that you mentioned, like, the story of Pocahontas and stuff, like, well, I gotta admit, I don't know too much about her or Lewis and Clark, and some other things. Like, as a Canadian, I didn't learn too much about that at all. So it's like, I feel like I can approach some of these on
Canadians aren't taught American history. What's going on up there?
There's stuff that overlaps for sure, but like, I gotta be honest, I didn't even watch the Disney movie yet.
Well,
I should, again, just for like, with fresh eyes and stuff looking at it. But no, it's kind of really interesting that there are some things that are ingrained in our
that American arrogance. I assume everyone knows our history, right? Yeah.
Right on. But we could keep talking about this for days for sure, and I do look forward to like maybe popping on your podcast and talking a bit more about this and some other topics, especially if we maybe both be able to experience some of these games along the way. I'll mention one movie really quickly, which again kind of plants a seed for me of like, oh wow, that was a really impactful moment. And this might be a controversial movie, Apocalypto.
Oh, you know what? I've never seen Apocalypto, and I thought maybe I finally will.
No spoilers. Okay,
watch it. Now I have an idea. Okay.
No spoilers, but the final scene. Okay, that's all I'm saying. Anyway, so maybe you can watch that before we can get together and talk more. Right. Just give me your thoughts. But again, take it with a grain of salt. But like, anyway. Okay, this is great though. This is exactly the type of dialogue I was hoping to have. We are thinking about some things the same way. I think we have a very similar approach to history and gaming and stuff. So maybe we'll get to try one of these games online. We're a continent on the other side of a continent from each other, but Lord willing, we could see each other at tables someday. But maybe we can hook something up and experience these with fresh eyes for the first time together online or something like that. But anyway, I really look forward to that. Do you have a rough timeline of like when you're hoping to bring stuff onto your podcast?
Oh gosh, I'm loath to say because I've been so poor about this, but I would, where are we? We're in the middle of kind of the middle of July right now, beginning of July. I probably will do this in 2 episodes, right? Probably and that's not uncommon for me to sort of like intro it when I've been thinking about things, and then play a few more games and conclude with that. So I'd like to at least get that intro out this summer sometime still, and then, finish up before the fall. That would be ideal. I hope so.
Okay, that's great. So now that you said it, you have to do it. Okay,
Yeah.
no pressure. But no, that's good. And folks, in the meantime, if you're waiting for these episodes to come out, go back listen to Mark's other stuff too. There's a lot of great stuff there. I still got to go back and listen. So I've only listened to a handful, but I just love the way you approach it, especially that 1-2 hit that you talk about. It's like, I'm gonna start talking about this. I know a little bit about this and these games, and here's why I'm interested in this history, and then follow up a little while later, like, well, now here's how that learning journey has gone. I think that's a really cool way to approach it. So
cool. Well, hey, I appreciate you reaching out to me, because I've been, playing around doing this podcast for a long time. No one has ever said like, hey, I'll do something collaborative with you. That's very exciting to me. So
awesome.
Yeah.
Well, like I'm kind of in the same boat you are. It's like when inspiration strikes, I just gotta get some stuff out there, and I just want to reach out and bring other people along the learning journey that are kind of on the same path. So I think this is very fortuitous to bring us all together. So thank you so much, Mark. Have a great learning journey. I can't wait to hear about where you end up next. And well, cheers for now, bud.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks for having me.